We've got Nir Eyal to speak today. He is the author of the book Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And as a special treat, as a reminder, Q&A we're going to do through Confluence questions at the URL bit.ly/ask.atlassian.com or ask-Atlassian. Anyone who does ask a question will be giving you a copy of his book, Hooked. So that's pretty exciting. Today, in 50 minutes, he's going to share the crux of it. And some things to know about Nir: he is a contributing writer for Forbes, TechCrunch, and Psychology Today. He's lectured at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Design School, and he has sold 2 technology companies since 2003. Thanks very much. Here's Nir.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Today we are going to be looking at the psychology of product usage. Why do people use the products they use as often as they do? Because if there's one thing we know about slide clickers is that they often fail right as you're clicking them. I'll do, let's see here. Nope. All right, we'll just use the keyboard. So if there's one thing we know about the technologies that we have adopted over the past several years is that they can have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives. And so what I've done over the past 3 years is to start looking at these companies and identifying what patterns repeat themselves time and time again in these companies that kind of come out of nowhere. These companies that are 5 to 10 years old and first start out as this nice feature, a nice little toy, a nice to have perhaps, and in the span of just a few short years, they're touching hundreds of millions of people's lives, if not billions of people's lives, and they're making hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. Now, the companies I'm talking about tend to be in the consumer space, but what am I talking about? Just let me hear from you all. What companies am I talking about? These 5 to 10-year-old little toys that somehow are touching billions of people's lives. Technology companies. What are you thinking of? Facebook, of course, the $200 billion behemoth. Did you really think 10 years ago that Facebook would be as humongous as it is today? Phenomenal, right? What else? Apple. What else? Twitter. Yeah, Twitter had their huge IPO this year. What else? Spotify, Google, Pinterest, WhatsApp. I'll give you 19 billion reasons why habits are important, because 74% of people who have downloaded that app use it every single day, and that, of course, equates to the $19 billion that Facebook paid for WhatsApp. Facebook also fairly recently bought an app called Instagram for $1 billion. 12 people, 18 months later, they sold that company for a bundle. Right? All these products demonstrate something very important about their ability to quickly create consumer habits. And I know that this conference is really targeted towards the enterprise, but I want to see if we can look at the kind of the mojo of these consumer-facing companies to figure out what we can learn from them. How are they so darn successful at changing consumer behavior, and how can we improve the products that we build by looking at the same principles? So we're going to be looking at a common pattern that I've done research into over the past several years to find what is it about these companies' ability to form habits. Let's get our definitions straight. What is a habit? Very simply put, a habit is a behavior that occurs with little or no conscious thought. It's this impulse, this itch to do these behaviors without really thinking about them. And it turns out that research has showed us that about 40% of what you do every single day, day in and day out, is done purely out of habit. Behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. And I believe that we are on the precipice of an age where we can use the psychology of habit design for good. And I'm not alone. There's an explosion of companies today that are using the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives by using this deeper psychology of user behavior. So here's the pattern. Actually, let me stop for 1 second. Let me give you a little disclaimer. Normally, I teach a class at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford in the course of about 3 weeks. I also wrote about a 250-page book. I've got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to condense a lot of information into a short period of time. There's going to be more available in the book that Atlassian has very generously offered to provide to anybody who asks a question. So you can read a lot more about that book. It's also available for pre-order on Amazon. It's going to be released November 4th. So here's the crux of the model that's in my book and the core of my research. It's the hook model. A hook, very simply, is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And what we find is endemic to these habit-forming products are these hooks. In series, one hook after the other, leading to more complex habits in users' day-to-day lives. So let's break down what is in a hook. What does a hook look like? Well, a hook has 4 parts. It starts with a trigger, through the action, the reward, and finally the investment. And you can see there's kind of an infinite loop here. So let's break down these 4 steps. The first step is the trigger phase. These triggers cue action. They tell the user what to do next. And these triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. We have our external triggers and our internal triggers. Now, external triggers, you'll be very familiar with. This is kind of our craft, our trade as product designers, as product people. We are all about external triggers, and you see these as consumers every single day. These are things that tell you what to do next. They tell you the key action, where the information for what to do next is in the trigger itself. So buy now, tweet this, click here, a police officer telling you which way to go in traffic, maybe a friend telling you about this great new app they found that you should really try out, all examples of external triggers. Now, though product people really know a lot about external triggers, they oftentimes fail to consider what is equally important in creating a habit-forming technology, and that is the internal trigger. These internal triggers are absolutely crucial if we're to establish these long-term habits. An internal trigger is something that cues the next action just as reliably, just as predictably as that external trigger, but the information for what to do next is not in the trigger, as in the case of the external trigger. It's in an association in the user's head. It's informed through an association in the user's mind. So when the user is in a particular place, a particular routine, around certain people, or most frequently when they experience a certain emotion, what they do next, what cues them to action, prompts their next behavior, prompts what they turn to. And oftentimes, what they're prompted to turn to is their technology. Now, not only are emotions frequent internal triggers, it turns out that there's a specific type of emotion that becomes the most frequent internal trigger, and I'm referring to negative emotions. When we're feeling lonesome or bored or dissatisfied or fatigued or lost or any of these negative states, we seek a solution. We're looking for something to take us out of this discomfort. And what we often do to alleviate the discomfort is, of course, turn to our technology. Now, some of the research that shows this is the case comes to us from a study that showed that people suffering from depression check email more. Now think about that. Why would that be? Why would people suffering from clinical depression check email more? Well, it turns out that people suffering from clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the rest of the population. And what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state? They're turning to their technologies. Now let's think about this in our own lives. What technology do people use when they're feeling lonely? What do we use? Facebook, of course. We use Facebook. What about when we're feeling unsure about something? Before we even scan our brains, what do? We Google it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you have that big project you don't feel like finishing, where do you go? You go to YouTube, you go to Pinterest, you check out stock prices, sports scores, lots and lots of solutions for this uncomfortable emotional state of boredom. We don't like feeling bored. It's a pain point. We seek to exit that state. Okay? So it's a bit of pop psychology. I see some of you kind of grinning and shaking your heads thinking, wow, I guess I do kind of use some of these products when I'm feeling these emotions. But what do you do with this? How do you as a product designer build better products? How do we improve people's lives knowing this information about the importance of creating associations with internal triggers? Well, it starts by identifying your user's itch. You can't scratch the user's itch. You can't solve the user's problem unless you understand at a psychological level what the itch is. What's that instantaneous emotion that they're feeling, part of their routine, that causes them, that cues them to turn to your solution. Okay? It's very important. There's a lot more about this in the book. Unfortunately, I have to kind of run through this stuff, but there's a lot more information on how to discover those internal triggers. The next step of the hook, after we've figured out what the user's internal triggers are and what external triggers we use to prompt the user to action, is the action itself. Now, this is the habit. The definition of the action phase of the hook is the simplest action done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. Let me show you some examples of consumer-facing products, which are highly habit-forming. And I want to show you the action phase in each of these products. And I want you to see how simple these actions, these behaviors are done in anticipation of a reward. Something as simple as scrolling on Pinterest, just that act of scrolling. Or searching on Google. Or pushing the play button on YouTube. These very simple behaviors done in anticipation of a reward. Now, it turns out that there's actually a formula to help us predict the likelihood of any given behavior, any singular action. And it comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of BJ Fogg. And Fogg posits this formula, that for any human behavior, online, offline, doesn't matter, any human behavior, we need three things. We need sufficient motivation, that's M. We need sufficient ability. Ability is how easy or difficult something is. And a trigger must be present. That's what we just talked about, these triggers. So for any human behavior, as represented by B, we need motivation, ability, and a trigger every single time. How many people have seen this before? Oh, good, good. So in a startup context, as you're developing your products, you can ask yourself, if your user isn't doing the intended behavior, this is a great vocabulary. This is a great model to look at what's going on with your user. What are they missing? Are they missing motivation? Is the product too hard to use? Or is the trigger present? And we'll talk more about this in just a second. But let's break down these three elements of motivation, ability, and triggers. Let's start with motivation. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, is the energy for action, how much the user wants to do a particular behavior. Now, psychologists have been arguing about the nature of motivation for decades and decades, but Fogg gives us these 6 basic factors, these 6 levers that we can pull on to make a behavior more or less likely to occur, because all of us as human beings, we all seek pleasure and avoid pain. We all seek hope and avoid fear. We all seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So every piece of ad copy, every commercial you've ever seen, every billboard leverages these 6 key human motivators. And you can too, of course. Next, let's talk about ability. That second part of B equals MAT, the A in B equals MAT is ability, the capacity to do a particular behavior. And here again, we have these 6 factors of ability. 6 things that make a behavior more or less likely to occur by making it easier or more difficult to do. For example, how much time something takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles. Brain cycles is a big one when it comes to the products that we're building and using every day, because it turns out the harder something is to understand, the less likely that behavior is to occur. Social deviance. Social deviance has to do with the fact that we become more likely to do a behavior when we see other people like us also doing it. And then finally, non-routine. Non-routine dictates that we become more likely to do a behavior simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. Because as we do something, it becomes easier to do, and as it becomes easier to do, we become more likely to do it in the future. What do we call that? That's called practice. The more we do it, the easier it becomes, the more likely we are to do it in the future. That's why many times when I talk to product teams, I ask them to look for things that are familiar to the user, existing mental models that take advantage of existing routines, existing habits. So we can put these 3 factors of motivation, ability, and triggers inside this little graph that I think is actually quite useful in a product development context when you're scratching your head asking yourself, geez, why aren't our users doing the things we designed for them to do? You can ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? The y-axis. Does the user have sufficient ability? Is the behavior easy enough to do? That's the x-axis. And if they do, if they have those two elements, you cross that threshold, that blue line, and if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur every single time. Online, offline, every human behavior. It's as simple as that. Let's make this concrete. I'll give you an example. I want you to think of a time in your own life where a phone rang and you didn't pick up the phone. Why didn't you pick up the phone? Let me hear it. You didn't know the number. Great, you didn't know the number. So that's an example of low motivation. Even though the phone was right there next to you, you could have picked it up. You had high ability, and you heard it ring. The trigger was there. But you didn't pick it up because you had low motivation. What's another reason? Okay, let's say you were in this little talk I'm giving. You had high motivation to pick up the call because you really wanted to answer the call, but it was too difficult. You had low ability. You'd have to get up. It's kind of socially awkward to take a call in the middle of my workshop. Thank you very much for not doing that. So you never crossed that threshold. Your ability was too low. It was too difficult to do that intended behavior. What's one more reason that has to do with the trigger why you may not pick up a phone? Okay, if you didn't want to talk to the person, that would be motivation. But what about a trigger? It's on silent, exactly. If the phone was on silent, even if you really wanted to pick it up, and even if it was right there next to you, you wouldn't pick up the phone because you never heard it ring. Don't be one of those companies, and I can't tell you how many times I come into these big, expensive design reviews. The company will hire me to look at their flow, and I say to the team, where's the trigger? What do you want the user to do? It happens time and time again. We have to have a clear trigger to get the intended behavior every single time. It's a very common mistake. So that's a little bit about the action phase of the hook. We've talked about the trigger, the itch that we're scratching. The action is the key behavior, the habit that we're forming. Now it's time for the reward. This is when the user gets what they came for. Now when we talk about the reward, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which was first studied by two Canadian researchers in the 1940s by the name of Olds and Milner. Now Olds and Milner found this very peculiar part of the brain did something very interesting. When they connected electrodes to the brains of lab animals, and they gave them a tiny lever that they could press on to stimulate this part of the brain, it sent a tiny current inside this part of the brain, they found that the lab animals wanted nothing but pressing on this lever. All they wanted to do was to stimulate their nucleus accumbens. Day in and day out, they would run across painful electrified grids. They would forgo food and water just to continue to stimulate this part of the brain. In later experiments done on people, they observed similar results. That when they gave people the ability to click a little button to stimulate this part of the brain, they wanted nothing else. They had to, in fact, forcibly remove these machines from people to get them to stop clicking. Now, it turns out you don't need electrodes to activate this part of the brain. Your brains are activated all the time in this very same way by the different things in our environment. The promise of sex, luxury goods, junk food, certain chemicals, and of course, right there in the center, technology. All of these things activate this very same and very important part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. Now, Olds and Milner, back in the 40s and 50s, believed that this part of the brain was to stimulate pleasure, right? Why else would lab animals and later people incessantly stimulate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. It turns out that what was actually going on is that the nucleus accumbens doesn't stimulate pleasure per se. It activates what I call the stress of desire. The stress of desire, because it turns out that what we now know through more recent fMRI studies where we can actually see what's happening in the brain is that the nucleus accumbens, that little orange blob there, becomes more active in anticipation of what we want, in anticipation of a reward. But when we get the thing that we think we want, when we get the thing that's supposed to make us happy, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So it turns out that the way our reward systems prompt us to act, prompt us to do the things that we do day in and day out, is to stimulate this itch that we seek to scratch. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge this effect, to supercharge this stress of desire. Does anybody want to know how? Anybody curious? Exactly. I'm doing it to you right now. Because it turns out that the unknown is fascinating. So when I took that long pause and I asked you a question with a question mark at the end and I kind of just waited there. Some of you perked up. What's it going to do next? Right? What's going to happen? It turns out that a bit of variability causes us to increase engagement and focus. Of course, this work comes out of the classic work of B.F. Skinner. You may remember from your Psych 101 class, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner took these pigeons, he put them inside these boxes, and he gave them a little disc to press on. And at first, whenever they would peck on this disc, they would receive a food pellet, a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the pigeons would would click on the disc whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little bit different. He introduced a variable reward, an intermittent reward, so that sometimes the pigeons would click the lever, nothing would come out. The next time the pigeon would click the lever, they would get a food pellet. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeons clicked on the lever, was observed to occur more often. It occurred more frequently when the reward was given on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. Because what we now know is that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens. Variability causes us to increase focus, increase engagement, and this bit of mystery is highly habit-forming. And so what we find in all sorts of products, offline and online, all sorts of products that hold on to our attention, that start these habits, is this element of variability, is one or more of these three types of variable rewards, which I'll walk through very briefly. The first, sorry about this formatting here. The first is the search for social rewards, what I call rewards of the tribe. Rewards of the tribe are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. So the search for empathetic joy, feeling good because somebody else feels good. Partnerships, cooperation, competition, all of these things are examples of rewards of the tribe. Of course, online, social media is a great example of rewards of the tribe. When Mark Zuckerberg got married, 1.3 million people liked it. And when you think about all the variability that's inherent in a product like Facebook, when you open up that app and you start scrolling through your news feed, you're thinking, what do people post? What photos might I see? How many people liked it? What are the comments going to say? There's a very wide range of social rewards that are all delivered on a variable basis with a product like Facebook. Next is the search for resources, rewards of the hunt. Rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other resources. And of course, in modern society, these things are bought with money. So when many people think of variable rewards, they often think of casinos. They think of slot machines, where the variable reward that comes out of a gambling machine is, of course, the money itself, right? And there's mystery about what you're going to win each time you play. But in fact, we see the same exact mechanism online. Think about the feed for a minute. Why is the feed in everything? Why does everything seem to have a feed today? It didn't used to. If you look back a few years ago, 5, 6 years ago, not everything had feeds. And today, everything has a feed online. Well, what is it about that feed? Let's look at Twitter. If I'm scrolling through Twitter here, that first tweet isn't very interesting, the second isn't very interesting, the third's not, but the fourth is very interesting. And if I want more of this reward, what do I have to do? Just keep scrolling. So this becomes very similar to this, right? The slot machine. Both variable rewards of the hunt, searching and never done searching for these variable rewards. Finally comes the search for self-achievement, rewards of the self. Rewards of the self have to do with things that feel good, have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about the search for material or information rewards. These are things that are intrinsically motivating, that feel good in and of themselves. So the search for mastery, consistency, control, competency, all of these are examples of variable rewards of the self. One of the best examples is, of course, in gameplay. If you're playing a game, even if it's all by yourself, you're not playing with anybody else, that need to get to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement is all about this variable reward of the self. And if you say to yourself, you know what, I don't play video games, I never quite understood that, that's not me at all, I bet you play this game every day. Checking that unread message just because it's there, because it's unread and you have to clear it. Or when you see that little jewel icon on an app and you just gotta open it so that it'll be gone. Or your to-do list where your goal is to finish these tasks so you can move on, are all examples of these variable rewards of the self. They're very, very powerful motivators. Now, before you say to yourself, great, I'll put all kinds of variable rewards in my product and it'll be super engaging and habit forming, let me give you a word of warning. The word of warning is that variable rewards are not a free pass. That fundamentally the variable reward, the purpose of the variable reward, is to scratch the user's itch. It has to connect with that internal trigger. So that if the internal trigger was boredom, your product damn well better entertain. If the internal trigger was loneliness, seeking connection, well then the variable reward should connect two people together. And where I see this gone awry is with gamification. Everybody's heard of gamification? Using points, badges, leaderboards, game elements in non-gaming environments? I'm not anti-gamification, I'm anti the inappropriate use of gamification. And where it goes wrong is when we plop in these game-like elements that actually don't serve the user's needs. They don't scratch the user's itch. So we fundamentally have to make sure that we're scratching the user's itch, which is why it's so important to understand that internal trigger in the first place. Okay? Because variable rewards are all about scratching the user's itch, giving them what they came for, and yet leaving them wanting more. That's the pattern we see in all these products. Giving the user what they came for, scratching their itch, and yet leaving them wanting more. Finally, the last part of the hook model is the investment phase. And this is the part of the hook model that I see most frequently neglected in companies that I work with. They forget to ask users to invest in the product. But the most habit-forming products nail this. And here's what the investment phase is all about. The investment phase is a bit of work that the user does for a future benefit. Remember, the action phase is about immediate gratification. That's what the action phase is all about. Give me my reward now, as quickly as possible. But the investment phase is done in anticipation of a future reward. And it's very important because the function of this investment is to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in the future. Investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in two ways. The first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by loading the next trigger. Let me show you what I mean. When I use an app like WhatsApp, and I've had this slide in my presentation way before the acquisition by Facebook, but when I use an app like WhatsApp, when I send a message, there's no immediate gratification. I don't get anything right then and there. There's no points and badges. Nothing really happens. But when I send a message on this app, and you can use this example in many other messaging services, I'm investing in the platform because when I send that message, what am I likely to receive back? One of these, a reply. And when someone writes me back, it loads the next trigger because now I get a notification that someone has just replied. And I become more likely to use the product because somebody's just replied to me. They've loaded the next trigger. That's what that jewel icon there is, the notification. So these products load the next trigger with these tiny bits of work, with these investments that users put into the product. There's lots more examples that we could discuss. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by storing value. By storing value. You know, one of the reasons I love working in the technology business is because unlike physical things, like your laptops, your phones, these chairs, everything in this room, things made of atoms, these things depreciate over time. With wear and tear, they lose value, right? But habit-forming technology should do the opposite. Habit-forming technology should appreciate with use. It should get better and better, more valuable the more it's used because of this principle of stored value. So for example, the more content I put into iTunes, for example, the more it becomes my one and only music library. The more data I give to a site like mint.com, the more data I give to that site, the better it becomes for me. I can do more and more with it. Same with Pinterest or Facebook. In fact, if you logged into my Pinterest or Facebook account, it actually wouldn't be that interesting for you because it's been tailored based on my data, just for me. It gets better and better with use. Followers. The more followers I have on a site like Twitter, the more valuable the product becomes to me. So if Twitter sent out an email tomorrow that said, hey, guess what? We're going to shut down Twitter unless you send us a check, unless you start paying for it, who's more likely to send them a check? Is it going to be someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers because they put all this investment in the site, in the service, by accruing all those followers. The service is more valuable the more followers they accrue. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank in these examples. So on TaskRabbit, eBay, Airbnb, people's reputation score determines how much they can sell their goods and services for. And how likely are they to leave one of these platforms after they've accrued a reputation? Pretty unlikely. Kind of hard to do, right? They spend all this time investing in their reputation. Okay? So these are all examples of investments and how investments increase the likelihood of the next pass by loading the next trigger and storing value. So that, my friends, is a very quick overview of the hook model, this trigger, action, reward, and investment. This pattern that we see repeated time and time again in all sorts of habit-forming products. And it's through these hooks, through these 4 basic steps, that users' preferences and attitudes are shaped and how new habits are formed. Now, that was a lot. I apologize. I told you it'd be a lot, so I crammed in a lot of information so we can leave some time for questions as well. There's more information on my blog, nirandfar.com, as well in the book, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. But this is the one slide that I think is the most important slide of the presentation. If you're working on a product that you're trying to make more habit-forming, or you're trying to ask yourself, why aren't people more engaged with our product? You can ask yourselves, using this framework, does your product meet this test? Do you know what your internal trigger is that you're addressing? What's the external trigger that gets the user to the product? The action, number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of the reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, number 5, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? So before I take questions, there was one more thing I want to talk about, and that is the morality of manipulation. That many people, when I give this presentation, they kind of shift in their seats and they kind of ask themselves, is this kosher? Is this okay to do this, to use the psychology of how we behave to kind of hack our minds into using these products? Well, that is a very good question to ask, and I think we should all be asking that, not only as product people, but also as consumers. Because let's face it, when you design an experience to meet your needs, to meet your ends, that is a form of manipulation. Now, it's not coercion per se, because manipulation can help people do the things they want to do, whereas opposed to coercion is getting people to do things they don't want to do. But still, we need to be very careful about this practice, about designing behaviors for our users to follow, because let's face it, the technologies that we're building, these are the things that users take to bed with them every night. The technologies that we're building are the first thing that people reach for every morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So we as product designers, we as builders, we as innovators have a very special responsibility that we cannot take lightly. Because the technologies that we're building today are more ubiquitously available than ever before. We have more power to affect people's day-to-day lives than we ever have before, and that is not a responsibility we should take lightly. So what I encourage you to do with this information, with this knowledge around how you can design behaviors, how you can design habits, is to fix one of the world's problems, to find ways to make people's lives more enriching, more connected, better through the use of habit-forming technology. And to build upon the words of Gandhi, I encourage you to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. While I'm taking questions, one more thing. I'd love your help. If you can raise your cell phones for just a second. Everybody have a cell phone handy? Do me a quick favor while we're taking questions. Can you go to this URL? It's www.opinion2.us. Notice it's not .com. It's opinion2.us. Very, very short survey. It's only 5 questions. Tell me what you liked, what you didn't like in the presentations. We'd love to know what you thought. As soon as you click Submit, you will be taken to my SlideShare page where you can have all the slides you just saw. Feel free to keep them, share them with your teams, do whatever you'd like with them. Okay? And my blog and Twitter address are here. And with that, happy to take some questions.
Great. Thank you, Nir. Actually, we've got some questions already through Confluence Questions, and you can take them right from the monitor. It'll switch up in just a second. There you go. And they're ranked by the number of points the people in the audience have
Great.
given to them.
And is it right that everybody that asks a question gets a book?
It is.
Everybody asks a question. Ask something. Okay, so what are some approaches you've used to measure effectiveness of your solutions? So this is an iterative process that, who here is familiar with the lean startup methodology? Almost everybody, right? Everybody's heard of lean. What are the 3 basic steps of lean as espoused by Eric Ries and Stephen Blank? What are the 3 basic steps? Build, measure, and learn. Build, measure, and learn, right? It's become part of our daily vocabulary. Build, measure, learn. Now, you still have to do that. You still have to do that with the hook methodology. But what I found, the reason I worked on this methodology is because when I was an entrepreneur, when I was running my last company, we were always stuck at the build phase. It became very difficult to figure out what we should build because let's face it, what's the most expensive part of build, measure, learn? What's the most expensive part? The building, right? Measuring and learning is fun and easy. Once you've set up the infrastructure, that's fun. It's the building that all the blood, sweat, and tears and money all go. So we still have to use that methodology. And to answer your question, we see if our solutions are effective based on build, measuring, and learning. But where this model, where the hook fits in, is helping us decide what to build, not just by building what the hippo wants to build. Everybody know who's the hippo? Who's the hippo? The highest paid officer? That's how we usually used to build software, right? Whatever the highest paid officer says we should build, that's what we should build. But now we're enlightened, right? Now we use lean startup. We talk to customers. That's great. You still have to do that. But I propose that we also need to dig deeper. There are also truths that the customers are unable to articulate, but still guides their behavior. And for that, we need to look to consumer psychology. And so this model is all about helping you build the right thing sooner, which, as we all know, is the difference between success and failure. How do you approach upgrading legacy products to habit-forming experiences? Very delicately is the short answer to that. Where this is most effective is in 2 places. In the very, very beginning of a product, if your product requires a habit, and by the way, let me just say as a disclaimer, not every product needs to be a habit-forming product. Right? This is not magic pixie dust that we can put on our product and all of a sudden it becomes Facebook. Your product may not need a habit. Plenty of businesses can create and deliver value to their customers without forming habits. But of course, there's other business models that necessitate habits. All the companies I just talked about, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and WhatsApp, they couldn't survive if they had to pay an ad to bring a user back. Right? It wouldn't work. The business model would crumble. They require habits. They required what I call unprompted user engagement. So if you have that kind of business model, this is a pattern to help you identify what should and should not be in your product. So the 2 best places to integrate this hook model is at the very, very beginning, in the wireframe stage, or when something's broken. When something's broken, you can't figure out why. When you built this beautiful product that the customers told you they want, and yet they're not using it. That's when you can take out the hook model and you can ask yourself these 5 basic questions that I showed you earlier on that canvas to figure out, hey, where is our hook broken? And with every company I work with, there's always one part of the hook that's deficient. And so this should help you identify, okay, that's where we should focus. We shouldn't be working on this part because it looks like we're pretty strong there, but you know what, we're really missing this part of the hook. Okay? What other books or other resources would you recommend to fledgling product managers? So in the back of my book, in the appendix, there's a whole list of all the references that I used to research the book. Also on my blog, nirandfar.com, on the right-hand side, at the very bottom there's recommended reading there as well. What are some of the best examples you've seen of good triggers in software? External triggers or internal triggers? Who asked? Anybody here? No? Well, let's talk about what makes for a good external trigger. You'll remember an external trigger is something that cues the user to action with some piece of information. And what makes for a good external trigger is actually pretty simple. That the difference between spam and magic is context. That if you can closely couple when the user receives the external trigger, when they receive the notification, the email, whatever it is that you're sending to the user with some piece of information of what to do next, if you can closely couple that with the moment in time when they feel the internal trigger, that's magic. If it's not, if it's just out of the blue, it's spam. Right? So I'll give you one example because the person asked for an example here. Does anybody use Yahoo's News Digest? Anybody use this app? It actually won App of the Year, Yahoo News Digest. Now, they have a growth problem, but they don't have an engagement problem. Because people who use this app use it every day, twice a day. I'm hooked. And it's just a news reader. And I don't know about you, but I've seen tons of news readers come and go. But what this news reader does that's just so easy and so elegant is that they realized that you want to read the news or listen to NPR first thing in the morning and last thing at night. How simple is that? So that's the only time they send you notification. Every other news app thinks it's a good idea to send you notification when there's breaking news all throughout your day. Well, I don't want breaking news all throughout my day. I'm busy. But when I wake up in the morning and when I'm about to go to sleep, that's a good time for me to receive this message. Why? Because that's when I feel this internal trigger of insecurity about, am I going to know what's happening in the world today? Am I going to sound silly at work when I don't know about this major news event? There's that pang of insecurity, which is why I used to have this old habit of checking the news on the New York Times or San Francisco Chronicle, whatever it might be, but now I just check Yahoo Newsreader because the prompt is right there. They know exactly when to trigger me when I'm most likely to be experiencing this internal trigger. In your research, do you ever see users go through more complex behaviors for perceived better reward? Do you ever see users go through more complex behaviors for more... I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. Is the person who asked that still here? Shy? I'm not really sure how to answer that one. Do you see users... More complex? I see. I see. Okay. So will users do more complex actions if the reward is better? Certainly. Right. That's absolutely the case because it applies to motivation. Now, how much we ask for our users to do in the action or in the investment phase is something we test. It's not something we ask an expert. It's not something we ask ourselves. It's something we test with our users. And of course, they'll tell us. If we ask them to do too much, they won't do it. We have to use ability and motivation to make that behavior easier to do and therefore more likely to occur. So that's where the build, measuring, and learning part comes in to test exactly how much we can ask users. What I typically see, the common mistake that I see most often occur, is that people put in the heavy lifting in the action phase. And that's not the place to put it. Where we put the work is in the investment phase. In the action phase, we want to make the action as easy as possible. That's not always the case. We can't always do that. We don't always have that luxury. But if you push yourself to think about how could I make this behavior as easy as possible to get the user to the reward quickly, and then try and put the investment after the reward, turns out that's a more advantageous place to put that work. And many companies, just by thinking of that framework, thinking in this context, benefit from getting users through that key action to the reward and then asking the investment, and that's where they yield much greater engagement. You want to do one more? How can design help break habits? Okay, so I love this question because the hook model, I built the hook model for two reasons. One is because I wanted to help product developers, product makers build better, right? My background was in the gaming and advertising industry, and I was constantly frustrated with trying to figure out what we should build next and what we shouldn't build next, and I wanted to help entrepreneurs and product people with that conflict. The second reason I created this hook model, and the reason I wrote this book, is that we all are consumers as well, and that I believe, as Paul Graham said, that the world is becoming a more addictive place, and that we need to be very careful about how we use technology and how we put it in its place. And so I actually use the hook model in my life to break the bad habits I don't want in my life, specifically when it comes to technology products, because by understanding these hooks that are inside these products, we can do something about them. So I'll give you a quick example. I'll tell you a quick story. We're all friends here, right? I can get a little personal. I wrote this article for TechCrunch called The Strange Sex Habits of Silicon Valley, in which I talked about this common dilemma that I happen to have, but many people since have told me that they also have, that our gadgets get in the way of our love life. And I was noticing that every night when I was going to bed, my wife was there next to me, and we'd be caressing iPads and iPhones as opposed to each other. So I wanted to fix that. And so what do? I looked at the hook model, and I tried to figure out where can I break the hook? Where can I put distance between the steps of the hook? So I did something very simple. I went to Home Depot, and I got a $8 timer. And this timer is programmable. And all I did was put in 10 p.m., plugged in the timer, put in my router into that timer so that every night at 10 p.m., my internet shuts off. We moved all the cell phones, all the gadgets outside of the bedroom. Now they charge in the living room. So that every night, 10 p.m., there's no more Wi-Fi. Now, could I turn the Wi-Fi back on? Of course I could, but I'd have to go get on a shelf. I'd have to go up to the router, unplug. It's kind of embarrassing after I've already made that commitment. So that simple action of putting some distance between the trigger and the action made all the difference in the world. Right? And I think we're all going to have to find ways to find space, to put technology in its place so that we can regain the focus and attention that we need to get our work done. Another product I can't live without is called Freedom. It's a very, very simple app that all it does, it's a pre-commitment device. You click the app, you tell it how much time you want freedom for, so it shuts off your internet, but you can't turn it back on, not like just shutting off your internet normally. You actually have to reboot your computer to turn the internet back on if you want to do it before the time is up, and that's a godsend. Because by just turning the internet off, I've got a little bit more space between that hook. So when I feel that internal trigger of frustration, boredom, whatever it might be, I don't turn to Twitter. I don't turn to Facebook. I'm able to create some distance to focus on what I'm working on. Okay? So in this case, technology becomes a solution to bad habits that we might acquire from technology. All right. I think that's about it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to hang out for a few more questions. Thank you.
Right.